The wind howled across the mountains, a biting cold sweeping through the trees as the car made its way down the winding, snow-covered road. James gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white from the tension. Beside him, his younger sister, Elena, stared out the window, her face pale, her expression distant. The two had not spoken much since the car ride began, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between them. Their parents had been gone for years, but the family history remained, buried deep in the old cabin at the edge of the woods. Their father's inheritance, one they had never spoken of, was about to resurface in a way neither of them could have imagined. The curse that had haunted their bloodline for generations. It was meant to be a simple visit, a weekend away from the city, to clear their heads. But as they approached the cabin, the ominous shadows of the trees stretched long and twisted, the sky darkening despite the time of day. James tried to shake the unease that gripped him. He had promised Elena that everything would be fine. It was just a cabin. Just an old, forgotten place. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice breaking through the thick silence. Elena turned toward him, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "You know what this place means to us, James. The rumors, the whispers." "I know," James replied, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "But we have to face it, Elena. It's the only way." The car finally pulled up to the cabin. The large, weather-worn structure loomed in front of them, its windows dark, as if watching them. The place looked as though it had been untouched for decades, the snow piled high against the door, the roof sagging with age. As they stepped out of the car, the air grew colder, the chill sinking deep into their bones. James grabbed their bags from the trunk and began walking toward the front door. Elena hesitated for a moment before following him, her steps slow and hesitant. "Are you sure we should be here?" she asked quietly. James gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We don't have a choice." He unlocked the door, the ancient wood creaking as it opened. The cabin was as they had left it years ago, with only the dust and decay of time to mark its passing. As they entered, a heavy silence settled around them, broken only by the distant howling of the wind outside. The door shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the empty cabin. Neither of them could shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The cabin was cold, unreasonably so. James tried to start the old fireplace, but the logs refused to catch. Elena began to unpack their things in the corner of the room, but her movements were stiff, as though every part of her body was bracing for something she couldn't name. James set to work checking the place for any signs of damage, but it was clear that the years had not been kind to the cabin. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. "Maybe we should leave," Elena suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. James paused, glancing over at her. "We can't leave. Not now. This is the last time we'll have to deal with it." She nodded, though the uncertainty in her eyes betrayed her calm demeanor. She had always been the more sensitive of the two, and the cabin, with its dark corners and oppressive atmosphere, was not helping. Suddenly, the wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows with a force that made Elena flinch. "Don't worry," James said, trying to comfort her. "It's just the storm. The cabin is old, that's all." But even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of the air shift. The wind was howling like some ancient, forgotten thing. The feeling of being watched, the oppressive sense of something lurking just out of sight, grew stronger. Elena's eyes darted to the window, her face draining of color as she saw something outside. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw a shadow pass by the glass. But when she blinked, it was gone. "Did you see that?" she asked urgently, moving closer to James. He followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. Just the snow, swirling and dancing in the wind. "It's just the storm," he said again, though his voice now carried a note of doubt. "Just the wind playing tricks." But the strange feeling lingered. It was as if the house itself were breathing, alive with a presence that neither of them could quite explain. Elena's hand reached for her necklace, a simple pendant she had worn since she was a child, and James couldn't help but notice how tightly she clutched it. "We'll be fine," he reassured her, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. That night, the cold became unbearable. The storm outside intensified, and the old cabin seemed to groan with each gust of wind. As they sat in the living room, trying to get some warmth from the fireplace, the air grew heavier, colder, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the cabin, sharp, like a door slamming shut. Both siblings jumped to their feet, hearts pounding in their chests. James quickly moved toward the sound, but there was no explanation. No door had slammed. Nothing had moved. Elena, her face pale, whispered, "It's already started." The silence that followed was suffocating. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. James could feel it now, too, the unmistakable presence of something old, something angry. Something watching them. The night wore on, the tension building with every passing hour. James tried to reassure Elena as best as he could, but he, too, was starting to feel the weight of the cabin's unsettling presence. The wind outside howled like a wild beast, and every so often, a loud thud or creak would echo through the house, making both of them jump. But they couldn't explain it. The place was old, yes, but it had always felt like home when their parents were alive. Now, though, it felt like a prison. Around midnight, as they both sat near the fireplace, the room grew unnaturally cold. A gust of wind swept through the cracks in the walls, and the flames flickered violently, casting eerie shadows across the room. James rubbed his hands together, trying to warm himself. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "This place is falling apart." Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and Elena shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "James, do you feel that?" Before he could respond, a violent crash came from upstairs, a sound like something heavy had been knocked over. Elena screamed, her face pale with terror. What was that? James bolted to his feet, fear gripping his heart. "I'll check it out." "Stay here, Elena." "No. I'm coming with you," she insisted, her voice shaking. He didn't want her to come. The house was already full of things they couldn't explain, and he wanted to protect her. But the fear in her eyes told him otherwise. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Okay, just stay close." They made their way up the creaking staircase, the floorboards groaning under their weight. The upstairs hallway was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the fireplace downstairs. The shadows danced on the walls, and every creak of the old wood sent a shiver down their spines. James reached for the door to the bedroom. His hand trembled as he twisted the knob. As the door creaked open, the room inside was empty. Nothing had been knocked over. But then he saw it, there, in the corner of the room, something moved. A shadow, impossibly tall, stretching across the floor. Before he could react, it lunged at him with terrifying speed. James barely had time to react. Something icy cold slammed into his chest, sending him crashing against the wall. The air grew thick, as though it was choking him, suffocating him. Elena screamed. "James!" He struggled to his feet, fighting against the cold force that had a grip on him. The shadow was like a dark fog, swirling around him. It whispered in an ancient language, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. James couldn't understand the words, but the malice in them was clear. Elena rushed to him, her eyes wide with fear, but the moment she stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping them inside. Panic set in as she pounded on the door, her voice shaking. "James, open the door." "What is that thing?" James could barely hear her through the deafening roar of the spirit. His head spun as the darkness pressed in closer. The shadow lunged again, and this time, it grabbed hold of him with an unnatural strength. "Let go of him!" Elena cried, her voice hoarse. Desperation filled her words. Please, let him go. She grabbed at the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Her eyes were wide with terror as she saw the shadow wrap itself around her brother. She had no choice. She had to help him. With no thought for her own safety, Elena turned toward the corner of the room where the family heirloom, a small, ornate knife their father had once kept for protection, was displayed in a glass case. Her heart raced as she snatched the knife and turned back to James, who was struggling to break free from the grip of the malevolent force. Without thinking, she plunged the knife into the dark figure. The shadow shrieked, a sound that shattered the silence like glass breaking. James screamed in agony as the force holding him released, and the room became still once more. The door creaked open. Elena rushed to James, her hand shaking as she helped him to his feet. The cold had dissipated, but the horror remained in their eyes. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. James could barely speak, his body shaking with the remnants of the encounter. I don't know. But we need to get out of here. Now." But as they stumbled toward the door, the darkness shifted again. A cold wind blew through the house, and the faint sound of whispers filled the room. This was only the beginning. The morning after the terrifying attack, the siblings tried to regain their composure. The storm still raged outside, but the fear that gripped them the night before had not loosened its hold. Every shadow seemed to twist in unnatural ways, and every creak of the old house made their hearts race. James sat by the window, looking out at the snow, which had begun to accumulate in thick layers outside. The world felt disconnected, unreal. He could feel Elena's gaze on him, but he didn't turn to meet it. He was too focused on what had happened the night before. "James," Elena spoke quietly, "I think I know what it is." He turned to her, his face drawn with exhaustion. "What are you talking about?" Elena's voice trembled. "The stories, the ones Grandma used to tell us. About the family curse. She said that the cabin, the land, was cursed by something ancient. Something dark." James frowned. "That's just superstition. This has to be something else." "No," Elena insisted, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand. This is what she meant. The spirit, it's after us. It's been waiting for someone to return." James ran a hand through his hair. He didn't want to believe it, but the events of the past few days were becoming impossible to ignore. Could it really be true? Was there something in the blood of their family that bound them to this place, to this curse? He couldn't say for sure. But the presence he had felt, the chilling force that gripped him the night before, was real. There was no denying that. "We need to find out everything we can about this curse," Elena said, her voice urgent. "We need to break it. Before it kills us both." As the days passed, the unease in the cabin only deepened. The once peaceful retreat was now a house of terror. The cold winds never stopped howling, and strange noises filled the air at all hours, whispers that couldn't be explained, scraping sounds from the walls, and the soft, echoing thud of footsteps when no one was around. James and Elena scoured the cabin for any clue, any sign of what could break the curse. But the house seemed to have a life of its own, hiding its secrets in the dark corners, taunting them with fragments of a history they didn't understand. One night, after another unsettling encounter with the shadowy figure, Elena found something, an old journal, tucked away in a drawer of their mother's dresser. It was weathered, the pages yellowed with age, but the ink was still legible. James sat beside her, reading over her shoulder. "What is it?" Elena's voice trembled as she read aloud, "The family curse, a binding to the land, a price to pay for sheltering a spirit too ancient to understand. The shadow that haunts us is not a ghost, but a guardian, one that demands a sacrifice, a soul bound to the earth for eternity." Her words hit James like a punch to the gut. "A sacrifice," he whispered. "But why us? Why now?" Elena continued reading, her eyes widening as she flipped through more pages. It says here that the curse is passed down through generations. The bloodline carries the weight of an ancient wrong, and only by confronting the spirit, can the cycle be broken. James felt the room close in around him. They were in the center of it, caught in something far bigger than they could have imagined. The spirit, the shadow, wasn't simply haunting the cabin. It was tied to their family's very existence. A loud crash interrupted their thoughts. The floor shook beneath them, and the air grew colder. The journal flew from Elena's hands, as if something unseen had thrown it across the room. The temperature plunged, the walls groaned, and a deep, guttural growl echoed through the cabin. "It's back," Elena whispered, her voice quivering. Before James could react, the door to the room slammed open. The shadow figure appeared again, more terrifying than before. It was taller, darker, and this time, its eyes burned with an otherworldly fury. "You cannot escape," the spirit hissed, its voice like nails scraping against a chalkboard. "You are mine." James and Elena backed away, fear surging through their veins. They couldn't outrun it, couldn't hide from it. They needed to end this, whatever it took. But just as the shadow lunged toward them, something unexpected happened. The family heirloom knife, still resting on the mantel, gleamed in the flickering light of the fireplace. Elena's hand instinctively reached for it. Without thinking, she plunged the knife into the spirit's chest, hoping against hope that it would work. For a moment, nothing happened. The shadow simply hovered there, its malevolent eyes locked on hers. But then, the spirit screamed, a high-pitched wail that shattered the glass windows and rattled the very foundation of the cabin. The ground trembled beneath them, and the lights flickered as if the spirit itself was fighting against the blade. And then, as quickly as it had come, the shadow dissipated. The air cleared, the room returned to its unnervingly quiet state, and the cold lifted. But they knew better than to think it was over. "We've only just begun," James whispered. The next day, the siblings sat in the living room, exhausted but resolute. The journal lay open on the table, revealing more about the ancient spirit that had cursed their family. It was not just a malevolent ghost but a force tied to the land, a spirit that had been summoned generations ago, in a time long forgotten. The journal spoke of one final confrontation. To truly break the curse, they needed to find the spirit's source, its anchor to the physical world. It was hidden somewhere on the land, bound to the earth by a ritual long lost in time. James knew what they had to do. "We have to find it." "The source," he said, determination in his eyes. "The spirit won't stop until we do." Elena nodded, though fear was still present in her expression. "Where do we even begin?" James stared out the window at the vast wilderness surrounding the cabin. "We start with the land itself." Together, they set out into the snow, the cold biting at their skin as they ventured deeper into the woods. The forest was silent, except for the occasional rustle of branches. It felt unnatural, as though the very trees were watching them. After hours of searching, they stumbled upon something, an ancient stone circle, hidden beneath a thick layer of snow. The stones were weathered and covered in moss, but there was a strange energy about the place. Elena could feel it in her bones. "This is it," James said, kneeling down to examine the stones. The journal had mentioned the circle, a place where the ritual had been performed. The spirit had been bound to the land here, in this very spot. As they investigated the stones, the shadow returned. This time, it was more powerful than before, a mass of darkness that enveloped them entirely. The cold wind howled, and the growling voice of the spirit echoed through the forest. "You think you can destroy me," it taunted. "I am bound to this land, and you cannot escape what has already been done." James and Elena exchanged a determined glance. They weren't backing down now. Using the heirloom knife, James began to carve symbols into the stones, as described in the journal. Elena stood guard, watching as the spirit circled them, its whispers growing louder and more frantic. The ground rumbled beneath their feet, and the air thickened. The spirit was fighting against them, but James didn't stop. With one final stroke of the knife, he completed the last symbol. Suddenly, the shadow screamed, its form twisting violently, and the earth shook. The stones lit up, glowing with an eerie blue light as the energy from the land surged through them. The spirit howled in pain, its form disintegrating into nothingness. And then, all was still. The wind ceased, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight of the curse lifted. For the first time in days, the cabin felt normal. The lingering presence that had haunted them was gone, vanquished by the power of the ritual. James and Elena stood in the snow, their breath coming in quick gasps. They were alive. They had done it. The curse had been broken. But as they looked around at the now peaceful woods, they knew one thing for certain: they had come far too close to losing everything. The family's past was filled with darkness, and the cabin's hold over them had been stronger than they'd ever imagined. But they had faced it, and they had conquered it. They could finally leave. But part of them would always carry the memory of the cursed cabin, of the fight to protect each other, and the battle to survive against an ancient force. Back in the warmth of the cabin, James and Elena took a moment to catch their breath. The weight of the past had lifted, and with it, the burden that had haunted their family for generations. They had broken the curse. James looked at his sister, a tired but genuine smile on his face. "We made it, Elena. We really made it." Elena nodded, her expression full of relief and gratitude. "I don't know what we would have done without you." "You don't have to," James said softly, his gaze drifting to the now silent woods outside. "We'll always have each other." As the cabin settled into an uneasy peace, they knew that no matter what challenges the future might hold, they would face them together. The past was behind them, but the strength of their bond would carry them through anything that lay ahead. They were free. Thank you so much for listening to Cursed Cabin, Desperate Fight, a brother faces a ghost to protect his sister. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new adventure. And make sure to check out the videos appearing on your screen for more thrilling tales. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, the unknown is never far behind.